At the RUSI of New South Wales, we have endeavoured to deliver our lunchtime lectures online, while our presentation venue, the Anzac Memorial Sydney, has been closed and other COVID-19 restrictions have applied. This has not been easy. Our presenters are busy people. Finding the time to talk to a computer has not always been possible for them. Our thanks to Dr. Gorana Grgic for providing us with this quality presentation. There is more about Dr. Grgic at the end of the presentation.
Hi all, thank you for having me at the Royal United Services Institute of New South Wales, even if it's remotely. Special thanks to retired Lieutenant Colonel Ken Broadhead, as well as John Howells and David Lease, who are working their magic in the background in terms of editing this video and making it available on different video platforms for you to see. I regret that we aren't meeting in person and that we won't have time to do a Q&A at the end of the talk and unpack some of the things that I've talked about or themes that I've flagged, but I am more than happy to answer any emails if you'll have questions that are kind of burning in your mind still. My contact details are on this cover page as well as the last slide of the presentation. So I am a lecturer at the Department of Government and International Relations, as well as the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney. And while I'm representing these institutions, I am speaking solely on my behalf and not in their name in any sort of way. So all of the insights that I'm sharing are based on my scholarly research. So today, I will be talking about the state of transatlantic relations at the moment. And I have made the kind of subtitle here, Convergence, Divergence, Drift, and Disaster. But I would say that there are elements of all of these things at any single point you kind of take in the history of post-World War II transatlantic relations. So there may be differences in terms of the magnitude of the convergence or divergence or indeed drift and disaster, but certainly transatlantic relations, just as any other, I would say, kind of history of relations between allies and partners tend to have the kind of aura of golden age and nostalgia for the past where things were much better. But then when we kind of unpack the past, we could actually see that things weren't necessarily always as rosy as they might seem, kind of looking couple of decades into the past, like from the advantage of future. So let's get started. There is a couple of slides that I've prepared for you to think about some of these things. And what I want to focus on are basically three things. So first, to think just a bit about the macro trends, the kind of history, grand strategy, issues of nomenclature, of kind of the terminology that we use and what it is that we actually mean when we talk about transatlantic relations, and then to actually take stock of what's been happening over the past couple of years to try to make sense of these clouds over the Atlantic and the big sort of debate about whether they were always there or they are somehow Trump's fault and it's actually the incumbent president that really exacerbated the kind of relations to the lowest point, one could say, in recent history. Finally, the third point that I want to get to are the 2020 elections and the prospects of change. If we see Biden presidency as opposed to Trump's second term, what are the things that we can expect will change, especially thinking about the kind of dynamics that I am going to flag in point 2. So let's get started. In terms of that first point on macro trends and history, grand strategy, strategic attention, and the very term of transatlantic relations, there are things that I hope everyone here who is watching this knows already, so I'm not going to spend too much time thinking about or talking about the kind of ancient history almost from this perspective, but basically how Europe became the kind of focus of American strategic attention with the onset of Cold War. Actually was the announcement of Truman Doctrine and the declaration of Cold War that was precipitated mainly by the events in the early years of post-World War II era, and US attention was very much on what was happening in Eastern, Central Eastern, and Southern Europe. And obviously with the grand strategy of containment that was chosen over other alternatives, we see the creation of a network of alliances, the most kind of deeply institutionalized one with the creation of NATO, but also furthering and sponsoring the integration on the European continent, where the United States had a non-trivial role, I would say, in precipitating the kind of Franco-German cooperation, which ultimately led to the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which obviously then led to the creation of European Community, which would become European Union in the 90s. And then obviously in the history of Cold War, we know that it wasn't all containment all the time with sort of the same magnitude and the same focus on all the different theaters in the world, and those being obviously Europe, kind of greater Middle East and Asia Pacific. We know that under Nixon and Carter, we see the easing of tensions with the policy of détente, a kind of step down from the kind of height of containment, which would then be replaced with the kind of rollback practice under Reagan in the Cold War 2.0, so to speak, after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in late 1979. Clearly, again, there are changes that result from basically the change in Soviet leadership in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, and by ushering in the reforms of Glasnost and Perestroika, he really sets the stage for what would ultimately lead to the kind of implosion of the Soviet Union, so to speak. But also these reforms precipitate and to an extent accelerate the already existing movements that were anti-communist in nature and pro-self-determination that were already gaining ground throughout Central Eastern Europe, and they culminate really with the downfall of Berlin Wall in 1989, and it took only just over 2 years for the USSR to collapse the day after Christmas of 1991. So Cold War ends, and obviously we know that we have this sort of decade, a bit longer decade of the unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer called it, the kind of era of US's unprecedented and unchallenged power. The end of history, as Frank Fukuyama called it, not because history stopped happening, but because it was believed that basically the dialectic between the kind of liberal democratic capitalist model, if you wish, and other sort of political doctrines and ideologies has come to an end. Liberal democracies defeated fascism, Nazism, and now communism. And basically, the idea was that we have now reached the end of history. Frank Fukuyama was very kind of clear and adamant about it after first penning a piece which had the end of history question mark, but already in the early 90s, a couple of years after publishing that first big essay, he published a book with the same title, and the question mark was gone by that time. But then, lo and behold, you know, it's never over when you think it's over. And certainly there were different sort of challenges to US power and hegemony that came both from within, but also from outside. First of all, the 9/11 attacks in 2001, which obviously led the United States to the excursions basically into the greater Middle East and these quagmires in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also the global financial crisis that essentially started with the subprime mortgage crisis that challenged US's economic power. And throughout this time, all that while the rise of the rest, primarily China, which would certainly by 2010 start looking much more as a kind of formidable systemic rival, much more so than it was, say, in the early 2000s when it was just admitted to the World Trade Organization, challenging the US supremacy, not just economically, but starting to assert itself in terms of strategic matter. And obviously, coming back to Europe, because that's the focus of our attention today, there are developments as well on the European continent over the past decade. I don't want to go into 2000s as well and, you know, talk about the changes in leadership within Russian Federation and all of the different kind of pressure points and tensions that the US had with Russia actually since it became independent and since Soviet Union was no longer, but really to focus on this return of the Cold War narrative that really starts ramping up with Putin's return to presidency in those contentious 2012 elections and starts going truly downhill with the Ukraine crisis, which was essentially precipitated by the revolution of dignity in Ukraine, and that led to the annexation, Russia's annexation of Crimea, and the patronage of the Russian-speaking separatists in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbas region, which has led essentially to the first wave of, or first round of Western sanctions, so from the US and European allies, to then go to 2015 when Russia really starts escalating its involvement in Syrian war in late months of that year, all the way to what we now know is and has been Russian interference in US elections, as well as a number of European elections and referenda, which led to the second round of sanctions, to then some of these other instances of, say, poisoning of former Russian intelligence officer in the UK, which led to a third round of coordinated US EU sanctions. And certainly for the past couple of years, Russia and China seem to be increasingly aligning in opposition to the West. They aren't necessarily allies, but they are certainly bedfellows out of convenience, and they are doing that on the kind of coordination and alignment in opposition to the West on many different fronts. It's certainly not a fait accompli that they will remain doing so. There are also different sort of imbalances imbalances in this sort of relationship, and a lot of suspicion as well, as you might imagine, given the opaqueness of both of the regimes, but certainly much more coordination in terms of their actions vis-a-vis the West. And finally, we get to the present time when a lot of us Russia watchers and just US foreign policy watchers are wondering if it really looks like the Cold War because of the breakdown of arms control treaties. So the early days of Cold War, and simply, you know, if you take a look what's happening or what hasn't necessarily been happening around the negotiations to extend or to renew New START treaty, and also at the same time the fact that President Trump has pulled out of some of the other arms and nuclear proliferation treaties from or deals, from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or the Iran deal to the INF. Obviously, a lot of worrying signals over there, and those don't instill us necessarily with a lot of confidence that, you know, we might be easing the tensions, but rather ramping them up. So if we want to talk about US strategic attention, just in macro terms, I would say that certainly for the first kind of 4 to 5 decades of transatlantic relations in the way that we see them or know them today. So in the kind of context of post-World War II, Europe was certainly at the center of US strategic attention. And this was the time when the US pursued the kind of deepest integration through military alliances and also just the kind of partnership and patronage of the European allies. Now, with the collapse of Soviet Union, the era should have been known as the Hour of Europe, for Europeans to take matters into their own hands. We know, you know, when the push came to shove, with, for instance, the crisis in the Balkans, Europeans kind of dropped that ball, and the US was pulled back in, actually employing NATO for the first time in a kind of military mission, open military mission in the Balkans in the 90s. But with 9/11, all eyes and strategic attention go to the greater Middle East, to first Afghanistan and then Iraq in 2001 and 2003 respectively, to finally 2011, when Barack Obama famously proclaims that that sort of strategic attention really needs to be focused to our neck of the woods here, the Asia Pacific, with the Asia Pacific pivot or rebalance, or now a kind of rebalance to the Indo-Pacific, as the region has been kind of reconceptualized, and as some of the terminology has changed, but certainly with a lot of distractions in both the Middle East and Northern Africa, as well as Europe all this time. So while the attention has long shifted away from the region, certainly the US has remained a vital regional actor. It still plays a pivotal role in NATO, obviously, despite what the incumbent president might think, and also because of the extensive political and economic ties it has with the European Union. Finally, in terms of the kind of threat identification, US national security strategy and defense strategy from this administration that were adopted in 2017 and 2018 have basically put Russia and China together as a strategic challenge. So even though I would object to that in terms of the kind of threat that these two pose, and, you know, in terms of the kind of long-term trends, the threat that they will pose relative to their capabilities, they are quite different beasts and tend to use different instruments, but certainly Russia still looms large as a strategic challenge, and some might say it has a kind of given the breath of new life to NATO, and kind of given it a new lease on life. Finally, one thing in terms of the macro perspective, when we talk about transatlantic relations, and this is something that's really important for me as a researcher of transatlantic relations to stress, and I can't stress this enough, we have to understand that when we talk about transatlantic relations, we talk about different things depending on the different kind of policy realms we take into consideration. So when we talk about US-EU relations, we normally talk about cooperation in terms of politics, kind of high politics, diplomacy, economic relations, and similar. So also, when we talk about those sort of domains, political and economic, we can include other non-EU member states, but primarily the bulk of that cooperation on political and economic fronts happens between the EU and the United States. When we talk about security relations, then we talk about NATO, and we really mean NATO when we talk about transatlantic relations on all things security. And this is important, obviously, because US is, and I hope that this is, something that I don't need to repeat, but obviously US is a member state, a pivotal member state of NATO, whereas it has nothing to do really with the way that governance happens on the territory of 27 states of the European Union. So it's a different sort of a process, so to speak, and there's different sort of mechanisms and the extent of involvement that the United States can have and buy-in, so to speak, and influence finally over the policy. So now that we have the kind of historical perspective, grand strategic perspective, strategic attention, and some of the terminological conundra sorted, let's turn to this big question over the clouds that have been gathering over the Atlantic. And the main question here is really whether they have been just President Trump's fault, or are they structural? Are they something that he might have inherited and just ran with it, maybe exacerbating and amplifying some of these negative trends, but certainly not kind of creating them out of nowhere. I've been collecting some of these headlines from the past couple of years of Donald Trump's presidency. So the past 3.5 years have given us such gems as, Donald Trump floating this idea that he would buy Greenland from Denmark, or slapping tariffs on European allies, or basically breaking away from the transatlantic community and kind of unity with his allies over issues such as Iran nuclear deal, or over warming up to Russia, and so on and so forth. And then obviously this kind of provoked a set of reactions from the European leaders, who have been saying that the US is doing things that essentially undermine their growth, or they simply can't be trusted. And there have been plenty of interesting kind of visualizations and kind of photo ops coming from some of these meetings where President Trump every time he goes to Europe and meets with the leaders of NATO allies or European Union states, basically does something that then, dominates the airwaves and news cycle for a couple of days. And these were just some of the kind of interesting imagery where, he manhandles the prime minister of one of the newest NATO member states, or has a mini arm wrestling match with Macron. And Well, they all seem to laugh about that at that point. But anyway, what hasn't been a laughing matter is really that the president has been almost allergic to all forms of multilateral cooperation, whether that's kind of institutionalized in forms of, intergovernmental organizations, or those that are kind of more based on treaties and various sort of deals that are made without, say, standing organizations being propped up, but also some of the statements that he has made around, European Union or NATO have been quite concerning. So almost concerning enough to basically get them taken note of and jotted down on the various lists that various legacy papers, papers of record have been putting together around all of the things and places that Donald Trump insulted over the course of his presidency. So European Union made a cut and has quite a lot of entries there around how much it has basically taken advantage of the United States and treated it bad, and how it's actually a foe to the United States, to NATO, which has been deemed as weak, that it must pay more, that it's obsolete, and so on and so forth. So there's plenty there to kind of support this argument that President Trump has single-handedly contributed to some of the lowest points that we have seen in the context of transatlantic relations. However, we wouldn't be good students of history or indeed international relations if we actually just stuck to that sort of description and said that, it's all been Trump's fault, and there is nothing more than just that. Because as a Harvard professor, a famous transatlanticist, Stanley Hoffman, said, the history of transatlantic relations is a history of crisis. Basically, there are plenty of issues out there that have chafed the relations for quite a while. And this is simply because the kind of relations between the two sides of the Atlantic have always been between kind of two asymmetric parties. They have always been these power imbalances, and they have actually been built into the NATO alliance. And what's more is that not just that we have this European military weakness in comparison to the United States, but also we've had times when the US frankly wavered in its commitment to the European continent. And also this other kind of dynamic where even when Europeans wanted to maybe grow more independent and to grow kind of strategically more autonomous and stronger, they've always been met with firm objections from the United States. So it's kind of been this sort of kind of dynamic of damn if you do and damn if you don't. So, you're not doing enough burden sharing, but if you try to do a bit more of burden sharing or actually venture into the place where you might become a bit more autonomous and extricate yourself from being under the US security umbrella, you are met with some of these criticisms like that Secretary of State Albright gave in 1999 when she said that there are kind of these 3Ds that are a no-no, and that's basically that the EU should not duplicate NATO assets, that it should not discriminate against non-EU NATO members, and it should not decouple the EU from the transatlantic security architecture. So it seems that, basically because of the fact that US is not part of the European Union, it has found it very hard to deal with the European Union, as the latter started growing more prosperous and more autonomous on the world stage, right? And granted, EU has been a peculiar foreign policy interlocutor from day one, but particularly these days when there are all these things happening in the world, and there is a need to coordinate response, but now more than ever you really don't know who to call when you want to speak to Europe, as allegedly Henry Kissinger said famously in the early 1970s. So do you call Chancellor Merkel, who is on the way out here, completing what is her final term in office, or do you call President Macron, who is basically going to be fighting seriously for his political survival in the next election that's less than 2 years away from now? Or do you call perhaps Boris Johnson, who hopefully will appear on this slide now? This is what happens with technology. Boris Johnson, or do you call one of the leaders of the European Union, such as Ursula von der Leyen, or her counterparts in the top of the EU leadership of the European Council, Charles Michel, or the representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Joseph Borrell. So if we then think about the transatlantic troubles specifically through the prism of US-EU relations, EU has basically always had this perennial issue, which is the lack of military power and some of the problems with building a unison voice in international affairs. Whereas both the US and EU have been dealing with a lot of political crises over the past decade or so, if you wish, where a lot of those crises have consumed policy bandwidth and haven't left much time or attention to maybe work through some of the issues in the transatlantic space. So, if you just think about the past decade from EU perspective, everything from the effects and aftermath of GFC, which led to the sovereign debt crisis, to the crisis with Greece, the kind of the potential Grexit back in 2015, before the deal was reached, refugee crisis, obviously, then Brexit, and the kind of the waves of populism that have swept the continent, as well as obviously the US having its own troubles, and especially more political crisis and scandals than one can actually digest over the course of the past couple of years under President Trump. And then also in terms of the EU-US relations, we have to understand that obviously, when we talk about the EU, we aren't talking about a single entity. We are talking about, again, 27 member states now that have a lot of trouble building a unitary voice that are split between the kind of old and new Europe, or East and West, or South and North. And then within the kind of North, you have different sort of shades in terms of those that would like to see Europe more kind of remain a kind of more akin to the confederal supranational model, to those that are more kind of aiming towards some sort of federation, and we are seeing some interesting moves on that front with, for the first time ever issuing of Eurobonds, and the idea that this might be kind of nascent birth of federation, but I would say we are still quite far away from there. But certainly we are seeing the US administration, particularly under President Trump, being attuned to some of these divisions and really using them, and sometimes, not just exploiting them, but exacerbating them, especially the kind of rift between West and East Europe, between the so-called old and new Europe, as Donald Rumsfeld made that famous or infamous distinction in the lead up to the Iraq War. When it comes to transatlantic relations in the context of NATO alliance, some of these things are related more closely to alliance management and the kind of theoretical expectations, so to speak, that are being played and tested in practice. So I've already said that President Trump is personally uncommitted to alliances and international cooperation. That has been true, but also US and NATO member states, European member states at least, have had this long history of not just the kind of the struggles around, burden sharing and whether European partners are contributing enough. It was, John Kennedy who complained about that already in 1963, but also about some of these fears of either abandonment on the one side that, might be felt by the three Baltic states, for instance, in case of potential Russian aggression, or entrapment alike if there would be escalation with Iran, which would be most felt by some of the biggest NATO member states, especially the P3 that were, or the E3 that were involved in negotiating with Iran and the JCPOA, so UK, France, and Germany. Then there are obviously issues around having divergent views surrounding vital issues. Again, something that's kind of structural where Europeans have tended to be more a kind of force for multilateralism, consensus building, whereas the US hasn't shied away from acting unilaterally. And again, not necessarily just under the Bush administration, but also thinking about, the kind of the fact that NATO intervention in Kosovo wasn't done with the official sanctioning of the UN Security Council, right? And then again, issues of that I already mentioned, the burden sharing, the concerns that junior partners have become free riders. Again, this is not something that has come just out of the blue. The Wales Summit, the NATO Wales Summit in 2014, was one that was attended by President Obama, and he himself said that NATO member states that don't spend 2% of their GDP for military are or they ought to do so and are expected to do so in this kind of new world of renewed tensions on the European continent. So basically, long story short here is that we have been here before, or at least in a place which looks quite like this at the end of Bush's second term, when the faith in US president was quite low in Europe, when there really needed to be someone who would resuscitate these relations, who would kind of bring a new jolt of life to transatlantic relations. And it's been proven that that can be done. But equally, even those that are greeted with, very high public sentiment can find themselves to be, at the end, just objects of protest and a source of disillusionment, similar thing happened to President Obama, who in 2008 delivered that speech in Berlin, was greeted by so many Germans who saw him basically as the kind of JFK reincarnation and the kind of, the redux of Ich bin ein Berliner, but then to get to 2016, where he is basically seen as this sort of embodiment of US doing what US does, from the surveillance scandal, where even Chancellor Merkel wasn't spared from her phones being tapped, or the contention over the negotiation of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So all of this brings us to the question, what can change? What can we expect? Should we see a different sort of result to the one that we saw in 2016, in 2020 elections? So what will happen if Joe Biden assumes the office, the Oval Office, and if Donald Trump is no longer the occupant of the White House? Well, before we actually even entertain that thought, I would just like to take pause and reflect on the fact that we really do live in pretty unprecedented, and that's a kind of cliched adjective, times that we even have to think about the elections in the United States as anything but free and fair, right? But this is the stark reality towards which we are gravitating at the moment. So there are all indications that, all of these various methods of electoral manipulations and mismanagement will lead to subversion of electoral process. The Republican Party has been employing a lot of resources to make that happen, from the different kind of voter restrictions that have been happening, and that states with Republican leadership have been instituting, to the very fact that we have these debates around whether the US Postal Services will be able to actually carry out the postal voting through the delivery of mail-in ballots, given that this has been used as a kind of bargaining chip in the negotiations over the aid that's meant to help the economy and people who have been suffering as a result of the economic downturn due to the coronavirus pandemic. So we might not know who the president of the United States is certainly not on the election night, but probably not even the day or days after. There is a very good prospect that or good chances that might happen. And that's something that's unsettling. But as strategists, as scholars, as students of international relations, of US foreign policy, we definitely can't but engage in what we do normally, and that's kind of try to sketch out some of the expectations as to where we might see things go. Should Joe Biden win, or should Donald Trump emerge victorious and be granted a second term? So in case of Biden's presidency, we can speculate that from everything that we've heard from foreign capitals, especially those in Western Europe, there would be an instant curative effect, at least on a symbolic level, if Joe Biden becomes the president. He is very familiar with Europe, with European affairs. He was once even considered as a potential Secretary of State back when John Kerry was running for the office in 2004. He is a transatlanticist. He has spoken quite often at various fora in Europe during President Trump's term, and he has made this sort of point that Americans would be back. Those were his words. So he would definitely work to repair those relations with traditional allies and re-enter various intergovernmental agreements and organizations that the US has pulled out of very much at the displeasure of European allies. There is a lot of prospect that US and Europeans would coordinate on areas of policy commonalities. I would say climate change would be the first one on the table, but then also on Russia and China, as well as Iran, for sure. China particularly on trade. But I wouldn't expect all of this to go, without any sort of hiccups or without the kind of setbacks or maybe sticking points, because the EU primarily has been developing a more autonomous policy vis-a-vis the United States. I don't expect this to change. It will only grow more strategically autonomous and independent, I think, in the years to come, as it goes through the kind of soul-searching phase, especially now post-Brexit, and especially as it realizes, for instance, that it has to find a way to navigate its relations with China and similar, but also because on the other side of the Atlantic, the US is also dealing with a lot of domestic pressures, and those will be an impediment to relations, to kind of deepening relations with the European Union, particularly, say, over trade relations and trade deal of sorts, the kind of resuscitation of TTIP 2.0. If Donald Trump is re-elected, we have to understand that he's actually not friendless in Europe. He definitely has friends, but they aren't necessarily on the west of the European continent. They tend to be in Central and Eastern Europe. Some of the news, if you have been following, there is it is not a coincidence that the troops that have been stationed in Germany have now been diverted, some of them at least, to Poland. There are more of these Central Eastern European kind of clients that are interested in deeper relations with the United States, in kind of more patronage and exploiting the benefits of that security umbrella, simply because they either face the existential kind of challenge and threat from Russia being on their doorstep, or because there is a lot of overlap in terms of their ideological affinities and kind of regime type or styles of governance that they might practice. So the kind of sovereignist kinds of leaders, and those with authoritarian tendencies in particular. And we will certainly see under Trump the continuation of unilateralism, which could actually lead to the greatest internal crisis of NATO to date. Trump is more likely also to, or most likely to, lean hard into the energy policy domain. His big sort of, the big theme of his approach to Europe in the past 3.5 years has been around the idea of energy dominance, of the US being basically energy independent, so to speak, of becoming a net exporter of hydrocarbons. We'll see how these things play out, simply because Corona virus pandemic has blown a significant has made a significant blow into the demand for hydrocarbons around the world. But if the growth will pick up, and if it will need to kind of move fast, there is this temptation to revert back to the kind of hydrocarbons to fossil fuels rather than make the recovery all green and carbon neutral. And finally, UK, which now after Brexit, or as Brexit basically kind of keeps on going, right? It has happened, but the kind of transitionary period is yet to elapse in full, will be looking to the United States, and it's more likely that Trump would be the one that bypasses the European Union and that tries to strike a deal before, or at least something that he could claim as a victory rather than Biden. But obviously a lot here hinges on UK EU being able to strike some sort of terms of engagement before any of those other bilateral deals take place. So time flies. Let me start wrapping up. We have come to the concluding section. It's just one single slide. To conclude with, again, 3 points. First one, we have seen US-European relations sour over a whole host of issues in the past couple of decades, from Iraq war to trade to mass surveillance. There have been plenty of these issues that have been kind of major roadblocks at certain points, or at other points, kind of sticking points that have certainly pulled the allies apart. But we have never seen a US president that has been as openly hostile to the EU and NATO as a point of principle. We have also not seen a president in recent times where his statements and policy proclamations have sometimes been diametrically opposite from the stance of his foreign policy bureaucracy, or the Congress for that matter, which makes both friends and rivals question where the US really stands on issues. Finally, as we get closer to the 2020 elections, we are presented with two completely different visions of transatlantic relations moving forward. One where we continue seeing the America First and all that it entails, and the other of basically some sort of rebuild of what's left of the kind of rules-based order, but one where certainly we won't be going to the place where we were back in 2016. I think that ship has sailed for many other different reasons, but certainly one where we could see US and EU coordinate more on issues that they both find vital, both from the kind of perspective of traditional security threats, whether that's China's or Russian assertiveness, to the non-traditional but even more dire threats such as the climate crisis. So with that, I will conclude my presentation and thank you for your attention. Again, I hope we can meet sometime in not too distant future and have an opportunity for questions and answers following a luncheon discussion, luncheon talk, that is, luncheon address. But I'm equally happy to connect via email, which you can find on this very slide. And I would just like to again thank RUSI of New South Wales, and just wish you all best of health, and please stay safe until we get out of this global health crisis. Thank you.
Dr. Gorana Grgic is a jointly appointed lecturer at the Department of Government and International Relations at the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. She was a visiting fellow at the Harvard Centre for European Studies in 2018-2019. She is also an adjunct lecturer at the Faculty of Arts, Business, Law and Education, School of Social Sciences at the University of Western Australia. Her research interests include transatlantic relations, United States alliances, conflict resolution and democratisation. Gorana has been a regular political analyst for the ABC News Australia and has contributed to a number of Australian and international media outlets and policy institutes. Prior to her academic appointment, Gorana worked for SBS TV and radio in Sydney and the UNDP in Zagreb, Croatia.